Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this final part of a softly spoken read-through of British kings and queens from the Anglo-Saxons to the House of Windsor. A well-presented book taking us on an illustrative journey of every single monarch from the fall of the Roman Empire to today. And we start our journey in this last part with Edward the VII, House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. He was born at Buckingham Palace in November 1841, the first son of Queen Victoria and Albert, the Prince of Consort. From the age of 7, Bertie, as he was called, was rigorously educated as befitted a constitutional monarch, but he was noted to be full of natural charm rather than any great intellect. From inclination he would have joined the military, but was excluded because of his position as heir apparent. He soon gained a reputation as a playboy, a course of action he decided on when informed that he was to marry Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Here is John Paul saying, "Yes, it's yours, Albert, but you'll have to wait until next Thursday before you get it." He was lampooned for the postponement of his coronation because of illness. While watching military manoeuvres in Ireland, he started a liaison with an Irish actress. When Albert and Victoria heard of the scandal, the former, although ill, went to Cambridge to reprimand him. 2 weeks later he died of typhoid, as we learned in the last part, and Victoria never forgave Edward because she thought the visit caused Albert's death. Here is Edward VII in the uniform of Colonel of the 10th Hussars, and in the uniform of the Hungarian 12th Hussar Regiment, presented to him by the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. So after a tour of the Middle East, Edward returned to England to marry Alexandra at Windsor in March 1863, and together they led a sociable and lavish lifestyle in London and at Sandringham House in Norfolk. Queen Victoria greatly disapproved. They had 6 children, one of whom unfortunately died in infancy, and the eldest, Albert Victor, died of pneumonia in 1892. Additionally, Edward had numerous mistresses, most notably the popular actress Lily Langtry and the society beauty Alice Keppel. Edward's infidelity was apparently accepted by Alexandria, but his mother and society as a whole were generally scandalized. How could you accept that behavior? When Queen Victoria withdrew into widowhood, Edward became her representative at public ceremonies and official functions, but Victoria would not make him her official deputy until a few years before her death in 1898, so instead he became a popular leader of London society and fashionable life. Politically they held opposite opinions. Victoria supported Germany, while Bertie supported Denmark. I'm really thinking this might be the first photograph that we've seen of a monarch. During the Schleswig-Holstein question in 1864, so because of his mother and his father-in-law, Edward was related to almost every royal house in Europe, and in winter 1871, Bertie caught typhoid. The public and his mother were hugely concerned, greatly relieved by his recovery. His popularity with both improved enormously. In 1875, Edward journeyed to India for 8 months. The tour was a great success, not least because Edward treated everyone with equal courtesy and enthusiasm. That's how you need to get by in life, just treat everybody with equal courtesy and enthusiasm. Queen Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901, when Edward was 59, and he chose to rule as Edward VII, rather than Albert as his mother had wanted. It's a bit naughty. And Edward and Alexandra were crowned at Westminster Abbey in August 1902. He continued to vacation abroad and was instrumental in ending the centuries-old hostility and suspicion between England and France, and also became the first British monarch to visit Russia in 1908, so seemed to have quite an impact on improving Britain's reputation on the world stage. Excluded from British politics, in which he had liberal leanings, Edward used his influence to reform the army and modernise the home fleet. He'd always been a heavy smoker, and in March 1910, when he was staying in Biarritz in southwestern France, he collapsed with bronchitis, and a few weeks later he was able to return to Buckingham Palace, but had been criticised for staying away during a political crisis. The public didn't know about his illness, Almost immediately he suffered several heart attacks and died. A sad immediate end, but seems to have had a very positive influence. We now have George V. We get, of course, a photographic image here, and ruled between, of course, the Great Wars. So he was born when his father, Albert Edward and Alexandra, were Prince and Princess of Wales in 1865 at Marlborough House in London. The second son, George, wasn't expected to succeed the throne. So being only 15 months younger, he and Albert were educated together, and in 1877 both brothers were sent to Dartmouth for 3 years naval training. They travelled the world, and George even got tattooed in Japan with a dragon on his arm. You old devil, George. And on their return, Albert was sent to Cambridge, but George was allowed to remain with the Navy. In 1891, Albert became engaged to his second cousin, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known as May, but within 6 weeks he died of pneumonia. George became second in line to the throne, and he had to leave the Navy to start learning his new political role. Queen Victoria still wanted the princess in the family and instructed George to propose. She also made him the Duke of York. And George and Mary married in July 1893 in London and spent much of their time on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where George enjoyed shooting and stamp collecting. They had 5 sons and a daughter. I think we may know who that daughter is. Or I might be jumping the gun. I think I'm jumping the gun. So here's an early photograph of George V here. And when George's father, Edward VII, became king, he and his wife assumed a greater public role. And in 1901, he went across the empire. In November, George was made Prince of Wales and included in state matters by his father. In 1906, he toured India, where he was thrilled by the country, but disgusted by the racism, and openly insisted on greater Indian involvement in their own country's government. It's interesting, I didn't know that. In May 1910, Edward VII died, and George became George V. He and Queen Mary were crowned at Westminster Abbey in June 1911. Their first official visit was a grand tour of India later that same year. So between 1914 and 1918, as we know, Britain and Germany were opposed in the First Great World War. And throughout the conflict, the king visited servicemen at the front line and in hospital, agitated for civil treatment of German prisoners of war and conscientious objectors. King Edward and Kaiser Wilhelm II were first cousins, and the entire British royal family had German ancestors and titles, a fact that caused great unease with the British public. Accordingly, in July 1970, George changed his family name from the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the House of Windsor and gave up his German titles. To many of his relatives who also lost their titles, he gave British peerages and names. Here are 2 of Victoria's grandsons, George V and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, after the wedding of the Kaiser's daughter on June 6, 1913. Meanwhile, the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin resulted in the creation of the Irish Free State, while the 6 northern counties remained British. Here's George V in full uniform, and here he is photographed in 1914. Over here we have Woodrow Wilson, the 28th United States President, with King George V in London. So King George's relationship with his son and heir, Prince Edward, deteriorated with time as he despaired of Edward's loose living and penchant for other men's wives. He dreaded how he would behave when he became king, and he greatly preferred his second son, Prince Albert, who would then become George VI. In 1935, George V celebrated his silver jubilee, but by 1938 his lifelong heavy smoking resulted in a variety of serious breathing problems, including emphysema and pleurisy. So he allowed Edward to take over many of his official duties while he retired for sea air to Bognor Regis in Sussex, and in January 1936 died near midnight at Sandringham House and was buried at Windsor. What a chronic smoking it would seem at this stage in the monarchy. So here we have Edward VIII, and of course, what's interesting here is that we see that Edward VIII ruled from January to December 1936, so just 1 year. Here is Edward, the Prince of Wales, with his brother George, at the opening of the International Peace Bridge at Niagara Falls on June the 1st. And here is the Edward, Prince of Wales, in naval uniform. So the first son of the Duke of York, later George VI, and Mary of Teck, was born in Richmond in London at the close of the 19th century. And Edward became Prince of Wales in June 1910, a month after his father became king. In 1911 he joined the Royal Navy, and during the First World War served with the Grenadier Guards but was kept away from the fighting. He did make frequent visits, which made him popular with the soldiers. In 1918 he went up in his first military flight and later became a pilot. And as Prince of Wales, Edward represented the king both at home and abroad between 1919 and 1935. He made 16 tours to various outposts of empire, and in the 1920s he was the most eligible bachelor in the world and the centre of much attention and gossip, especially his penchant for married women, the most notorious of which was the twice married and twice divorced Wallis Simpson. The king greatly disapproved of the relationship, and the personal relationship with his son became very difficult. This is a statue of him in Aberystwyth in Wales, which is probably the only public statue of him anywhere, and a formal photographic portrait of King George VI that we'll get onto in a moment. On January the 20th, 1936, King George V died and Edward became king, and his government was anxious about the king with regards to Mrs. Simpson and their belief that he would interfere with government. And it was becoming clear that Edward planned to marry Mrs. Simpson and planned for a secular coronation because she was a divorcee, were drawn up using the banqueting house in Whitehall instead of Westminster Abbey. And on November the 16th, 36, Edward summoned his Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and announced his intention to marry. Baldwin told him it was unacceptable to his subjects and in the laws of Church of England, and Edward proposed a compromise. Wallis would not become queen, and any children would not inherit. The British Parliament refused, as did almost all of the parliaments of the Dominions, because under law their permission was needed too. So Edward announced that if he did not get his way, he would abdicate, and Baldwin replied with 3 choices: give up Mrs. Simpson, abdicate, and marry her, causing the government to resign and create a constitutional crisis. So forced into a corner, on December the 10th, 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication in front of his 3 brothers. The following night he broadcast to a shocked nation and empire, explaining how he would not give up the woman he loved, and then left the country. Princess Albert, Duke of York, became king, and Edward was given the title of Duke of Windsor. And in June 1937 the Duke of Windsor and Wallis Simpson married in France. King George VI forbade all members of the royal family to attend the ceremony, and Edward was allowed an allowance, not as much as he wanted, on the condition that he did not return to Britain without invitation, but Wallis was not given the title Her Royal Highness, as he constantly demanded. They had no children. In 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Hitler in Germany, and were suspected of being Nazi appeasers and sympathisers, making them even more personally unpopular in Britain. During World War II, the Duke was appointed Governor of the Bahamas. Speculation still continues that Hitler planned to reinstate the Duke as king when he invaded Britain, and after the war the Duke and Duchess moved to France, where they remained for the rest of their lives. He died in May 1972 of throat cancer. He was a heavy smoker, carrying on a family tradition there, and after lying in state he was buried at Windsor. The Duchess died in 1986 and was buried beside him. A natural story of true love there. We have George VI. Prince Albert, who was Bertie to his family, was born on the Sandringham estate, the son of the Duke and Duchess of York, and great-grandson of Queen Victoria, on the anniversary of his great-grandfather Albert's death. As the second son, and 4th in line to inherit the throne, he wasn't expected to inherit it, and was not a strong child, suffered from a stammer, chronic stomach problems, and knock knees, all of which made him very withdrawn. Of course, this is the king that we may know from Colin Firth's interpretation in the film The King's Speech. At age 14, he became a naval cadet at the Royal Naval College on the Isle of Wight, and then at Dartmouth in Devon. Then in May 1910, he became second in line to the throne when his father became King George V. During World War I, Albert saw action as a midshipman at the Battle of Jutland, but then a duodenal also stopped further service. And in 1918 he was sent to the naval training establishment at Cranwell, which within the year became the Royal Air Force, and Albert transferred across the services. In the 1920s he started to help his father out with royal duties, visiting factories, rail yards and mines, and earning himself the nickname the Industrial Prince. And in 1920 Albert met and fell in love with a commoner, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and they married in April 1923 in Westminster Abbey. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Now we know who these are, and lived quietly in London. In January 1936, King George V died, and the Prince of Wales became Edward VIII and Albert heir presumptive. Within a year, the abdication crisis had forced the uncrowned Edward VIII from the throne and installed a very reluctant Albert 3 days off his 41st birthday, and he chose to reign as King George VI. Coping with the aftermath of the abdication was his first job. He conferred the title of Duke of Windsor to his demoted brother and had to buy his private estates of Sandringham and Balmoral Castle from him. He was crowned on May 12, 1937, the date initially intended for Edward, and it was a tense time with war in Europe becoming more inevitable by the day. In 1939 the King and Queen toured Canada as King and Queen of Canada and briefly visited the US in a political move to familiarise and popularise Britain with the North American public at a time when war was about to erupt. Here they are before they became George VI and Queen Elizabeth. And here is George VI, General Mark Clark and General Sir Harold Alexander in a command car before leaving to review Fifth Army troops. So war was declared in 1939, and the King and Queen announced that they would stay in London and not move to Canada, and safety has been suggested. They repeatedly made morale-boosting visits to factories, bombed areas, particularly the devastated East End of London, and abided by the public food rationing their subjects had no choice but to observe, which is good. Their personal popularity and that of their 2 girls soared, and in 1939 George went to France to visit the British Expeditionary Force, in 1943 to North Africa after the victory at El Alamein, and in 1944 to the Normandy beaches 10 days after D-Day, and then later Italy and the Netherlands. The period after the war saw the dissolution of the British Empire. It started with the Balfour Declaration in 1926 and the emergence of Commonwealth of Nations. Never a strong man physically, the stress of the war coupled with his heavy smoking took a toll on George's health. He developed lung cancer, and in September 1951 had his left lung and its accompanying tumour removed, and on February 6, 1952 died in his sleep from a coronary thrombosis at Sandringham. Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya and flew back immediately. After lying in state at Westminster Hall, George VI was buried in Windsor. And now we're brought up to the modern day. What is the modern day for this book? It says rules 1952 to present, but of course we know that that is not the case. The Queen sadly passed a few months prior to the recording of this video. We now have King Charles III, but here is Princess Elizabeth before she became Queen, raised to be a monarch from a very early age, and perhaps more as well how we know her to this day in her iconic hats, brooches, outfits. So she was born in Mayfair to Albert and Elizabeth, the Duke and Duchess of York. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, third in line to the throne, wasn't expected to succeed the crown until her uncle, Prince of Wales, as we know, unexpectedly abdicated in 1936. Had her parents had a son, he would have taken precedence. But her father became King George VI in 1936, and their quiet family life completely changed. At age 13, at the start of World War II, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle, close to, but not actually in London, and her father, the King, carefully protected her from entering public life too young, despite various suggestions and requests for her to do so from his politicians. In 1942, Elizabeth was appointed a Councillor of State, and in her father's absence in Italy, carried out some official business of state for the first time. Elizabeth first started royal duties on her own in 1945, when she accompanied her parents to meet Commonwealth service personnel. Later that year, and to show some solidarity with the British people at wartime, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she trained as a driver and then served as a military truck driver. And by war's end, she was a junior commander. In November 1947, she married her second cousin, once removed, Philip Mountbatten, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was formerly Prince Philippos of Greece and Denmark, and he was still serving as an officer in the Royal Navy. Between 1949 and 51, they lived in Malta while Philip served there. Their first of their 4 children, and the heir, and now our monarch, Charles, was born in 1948. As we know, by 51, King George VI's health was noticeably deteriorating, and Elizabeth took over some of his public duties that included a number of foreign visits. In January 1952, Elizabeth and the Duke set out for a tour of Australia and New Zealand, a trip that was originally planned for her parents, and they were in Kenya when the news of the King's death arrived on February the 6th. The trip was cancelled and the couple returned to Britain. Elizabeth was crowned on June the 2nd at Westminster Abbey. And for the first time, the ceremony was televised and seen by an estimated 20 million people. So the British Empire had started to be legally dismantled in 1931 to become the Commonwealth of Nations, and this process continued under Elizabeth. In 1953 and 54, Elizabeth and Prince Philip circumnavigated the globe on a 6-month tour, meeting heads of state and religious leaders around the world. This pattern of important public foreign tours continued at regular intervals throughout her reign, although it decreased somewhat in her later years. In 1965, she became the first British monarch in 52 years to visit Germany, the land of many of her ancestors, and in 1991 she became the first British monarch to address a joint session of the US Congress. In 1977, she celebrated her Silver Jubilee as monarch with a nationwide tour and many Commonwealth visits, racking up a total of 56,000 miles. In 2002, she celebrated her Golden Jubilee with further tours of the nation and Commonwealth. She was the oldest reigning monarch in British history, and only Victoria sat on the throne for longest. And I think she broke that record by the time of this video. By the end of her reign, as a constitutional monarch, the Queen is officially impartial, has no power over government, but she does have influence through her weekly private audiences with her Prime Minister. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth has read through volumes of state papers, making her better informed and more experienced than any politician. And that concludes our history to date up until this book was written of the British monarchy, and ends with Queen Elizabeth. So thank you so much for joining me. There is a little bonus addition to this book that we'll be sharing as a final added part, I suppose, which is through the Scottish kings and Welsh princes through the ages. So I look forward to having you join me for them, but until then, goodbye.